I could have asked a dozen questions, 100 questions. Bob Campbell stood right in front of that little well house and just shook his head. There's nothing here, no track nor trace. I said, no, they took it all down. And that's when he had tears in his eyes. He said, a part of my life is just gone. He said, I can't believe that there isn't some kind of a memento here to let people know that we were here. When I'm not here, there's nobody else to tell the story.
Hitler was boasting in 1939 when the war started about a new technology which he felt was going to change the direction of the war. He begins mining the channel and the waters around the United Kingdom. The United States Navy actually sent a group of personnel over to investigate this mine. The devices he was using were magnetic mines, very much like the ones that were being tested in Selmah. My interest in military history stems from my family ties. I had a great-grandfather who is in the British Navy. I had a great-uncle who served in the British Army. And of course, my grandfather served in the Canadian Forces during World War II. It all comes from that family connection, but predominantly it's World War II and that era from 1939 to 1945 that captures my interest every time. About 11 years ago, my mom comes to me and tells me a story about an abandoned military base in Selmah, Nova Scotia, not far from where she grew up in Maitland, and that this base may have been an American military base at some point, possibly even the US Navy. So I knew the area, and it surprised me at first that there would be a secret military base in that particular part of Nova Scotia. So I looked into it a little bit. I found a few references to the base. There were some photos of concrete and maybe where foundations were and things like this. But there was definitely some talk on the internet about this base. But there wasn't a whole lot to tell a story about at that time. The other part of it was there was nothing that was remaining, which from a filming perspective makes it a little difficult to do a story on something. So I passed on the story at that time and didn't pay much attention to it. And then recently it came up again, talking about wedding anniversaries with my parents. Turns out they had their wedding reception at one of the buildings that was remaining on the secret military base. They cleaned it up, hooked up the power, and that's where they had the reception back in 1965. She mentions again, should do some type of story. And when I revisited the subject, there was basically nothing that identified the story or the base. There was no mention of it. So it caught me because I felt at that time, well, there you go, there's history disappearing. You know, history disappearing right before my own eyes in my time. And that made me dig in a little deeper. My mom's still very connected to the area. She put me in touch with Pat Whitten at the East Hants Historical Society. I spoke to her a little bit, back and forth via the internet, and essentially she confirmed that, you know, we know a little bit, we don't know everything, aware of the history, but certainly interested in helping us find more. And she put me in touch with Fred Anthony. And Fred, again, very interested in the history of the area, very interested in finding out more about the base. He connected me to Merrill Miller, telling me that, you know, Merrill used to work there. Well, that's interesting. Somebody used to work there, somebody has direct knowledge. And he's got some photos. So I'm thinking, okay, great, some photos. Is that, you know, 5 or 6 or whatever? I'd take anything because I could find nothing at this point. Turns out he had a whole lot more.
The contractors moved in, and it all happened just really fast, and they worked diligently there, and it was cold, frozen, big piles of frozen mud. But they built it in the wintertime. I don't know why. They just needed it, and they move ahead, build it. I suppose the reason I got the job there is that I was poking around and was always hanging around and in their way, and so they gave me a job to work in the kitchen.
What did you call yourself? What was your job title back
then? I guess in terminology it'd be cookie.
Yeah, yeah.
But it was mostly just, hey, you.
Yeah, can imagine.
Get a move on.
A bunch of young guys together, yeah. That's right. I'm hungry.
Merrill's an important person in this story. He is bright, articulate, inquisitive, and all of those things still in his 90s. And the fact that he's connected directly to the base, worked there, knew the people, Merrill knows the name of each and every individual, can tell you a little backstory about each of the people. And isn't that what it's all about? Adding that little bit of context to history, because these folks aren't around to be able to tell their story now.
You know, for years I've known about this story, and there's nothing on the internet about it of any great consequence. You really have to look hard to find anything, and when you find anything, it's very little.
Yeah.
None of it is photographic. And then I meet you, and you have everything that you could possibly want to prove that this base existed and what it did. And all of this is one gentleman visits you. We figured now about 13 or 14 years ago. Tell me about that gentleman.
Bob Campbell, he was the CO. I say CO, he's probably called something else. From about 6 or 8 months after they arrived there, the other guy was sent back and Bob Campbell took over.
You hadn't been in contact with him since the base closed, probably just before that. And all of a sudden this one day, somebody shows up.
So he flew up from the States, landed in Nova Scotia unannounced, and just took an ad hoc trip out to Maitland to possibly run into Merrill. And being a small town, he did run into Merrill. Basically asked the first person on the street, have you seen Merrill Miller? And that person said, yeah, Merrill's right over there.
And I glanced up, and the guy coming in, walking in my lane, and I had no idea who he was. No. And he looked at me and he said, are you Merrill? Yes. Oh my God. And he just shook his head. He looked at me and shook his head. And do you know who I am? No, you look familiar, but I don't know who you are. Bob Campbell. He said, the Navy base. Bob Campbell from the Navy base? Yes. Well, we hugged each other and tears in our eyes, and he was so glad to see me as I was to him. It was just a shock to me, and I think a shock to him also. Last he remembered me as a little snotty-nosed kid about yay high. So we talked, and he only had a short time, and I wish he had have stayed longer because I would have quizzed him on many, many guys and many, many things.
He looked at Merrill and said, look, I've got a ton of photos that you should probably have, because other than, you know, me, you're the only person that knows this place ever existed and what it was.
Thus, a lot of these little photos came about a month later in the mail. Big brown envelope.
He followed through and sent all these photos. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this record of photos that Merrill could show us. It's an incredible find of a place that you would probably not even know existed if you were standing on the site this day.
There was not much interaction between myself and the guys.
Okay.
I stayed in the kitchen, and I had a room upstairs. I could go up there, but you didn't go in and talk. You didn't go in if you felt like it. But their talk was over my head all the time anyway, and I was just a nosy kid.
So how old were you at that time?
I'd be 14 then, I guess.
Yeah.
13 when I went there, and 14 in July, and so the next 3 years I was there with them.
Was it unusual in the community? It just strikes me as being something that would be almost shocking.
Yeah, when I think back of it, I said, ooh, people were really whispering, what's going on over there? It's the American Navy coming in here. Oh my Lord, what are they going to do to the place? Should we hide? There was a lot of apprehension of what might happen. We had no idea, and they didn't tell you. It was very secretive.
The very first memory you have of something happening at that base is what, when you think back on it?
The one thing that comes to mind is the guy that was drilling the well, Luther Spencer. He had an old one-lung engine and a belt and an old dilapidated pounder drill. And he was there for 3 months drilling a well for them. It was his last well he ever drilled.
Isn't it interesting that your very first memory of that place is the only thing that actually probably exists on the site?
I never thought of it. That's true. It's still there.
Yeah.
Well, he provided a good well.
Now, when they first arrived and started to scout the area in that summer period of 42, one of the locals in Maitland gave up their shed or their barn.
That was Albert Ammon,
Yeah.
and he's still in Maitland today. And they needed a place to store things because they were there before the sheds were all ready. So they stored the place there, and on the end of the door, they stamped NOL, and that's still there today. You can still see it.
Yeah.
Naval Ordnance Laboratory.
It's pretty important for people to know because that directly links that base to the American.
Yeah, yeah. It's just coincidental that they used it, but it's there, and they did.
Yeah.
And then as soon as they were ready, they moved everything out and took it down there.
When it was built, when the
When
base
they
was
were ready down there for this shop, yeah.
There's a great shot of American equipment being offloaded from a Canadian National rail car onto the ground in South Maitland. It's an interesting photo because it ties everything together. Must have been some of the very first photos taken because it seems to me like they're trying to tell a story. The garage or the shed that they're going to store all this equipment in while the base is being built. Vintage shots of what would be 1940s Maitland. It shows the unpaved streets and a lot of the same buildings existing in the exact same spots. And it also shows the old hotel where, some of the U.S. Navy military people and maybe even the specialists would have stayed at first while the base was getting ready.
When you start to sketch the base together, you've got the bunker up in the hill away from the main base. You've got that main building where the guys slept and ate and relaxed and where you did most of your work. Then there's the commander of the base. His quarters are across the street, and the cook, they also put him across the street separately. What other buildings are we talking about around that main building where you did your work? What other
There
buildings?
are 2 other big buildings, one of them almost equal in size. In fact, the other 2 are almost equal in size. One was their workshop,
Yeah.
the technical place.
Yeah.
The other place was where they fixed the machinery. A garage, in other words,
Right.
just to keep the trucks on the road.
How often were you in the place where they had the lab?
Oh, as often as I could get away and go in and poke around and looking at this and looking at that.
There's that great photo that's taken inside that lab area.
You can see a very blurry figure on the left who must have moved while the photo was being taken. But obviously he looks like he's working at a bench. You can see in the background, you can see the garage door. The photo's interesting to me because it really is the only photo that we have of the inside working area, the lab. He remembered being in that area. He remembered the workbench off to the left. He remembered everything as if he was that 14-year-old kid again. This is the only photo that I know of that exists that represents some of the work that went on in that, what would have been a really secretive area at that time frame.
They never told me anything, and I didn't ask.
No.
I wasn't really interested enough. I just was curious as I had a curious mind, and I watched them, and then they'd go into a room off to the side and do calculations in there, and they'd shut the door.
So I was curious about what they might be testing. And they look like bombs, or they look like torpedoes. So I sent those photos to a friend of mine, Chris Havern, who's a naval historian. And he sent it to a number of his associates, and everyone concluded that, by the looks of it, they were testing US Navy mine technology.